Good evening. My name's Louise Denoon. I'm the Executive Director, Public Libraries and Engagement at the State Library of Queensland, and I'd like to welcome you all here, especially given the rain that notoriously puts Brisbane people off, so it's great that you're all here. So this is our first 2020 lecture with the Grattan Institute, and it's fantastic to have you here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of State Library on Kurilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition here today. I also acknowledge and welcome our event partner, the Grattan Institute, and like to welcome our guest speakers, although there is one conspicuously absent, but they'll be sharing their insights and expertise today. First, Tony Wood, the Energy Program Director at the Grattan Institute, who'll be facilitating the conversation. Peter Ashworth, the Chair in Sustainable Energy Futures at the University of Queensland. And to make a star appearance at some stage, Ian McFarlane, Chief Executive of the Queensland Resource Council. Grattan Institute is dedicated to developing high-quality public policy for Australia's future. They're a non-partisan think tank committed to providing independent, rigorous and practical solutions to some of the country's most pressing problems. Our partnership with Grattan Institute has been going for a number of years, and we're really proud to continue that collaboration with this very topical lecture here tonight. State Library is an inclusive and welcoming place, offering a space for everyone to engage in open public discussion and debate, both online and on-site. We want to inspire possibilities through knowledge, stories and creativity, and encourage robust conversations and the sharing of diverse voices and opinions. Tonight, our guest speakers will discuss coal, here today, where tomorrow, and how this major industry will fare in a carbon-constrained world. The event is being live streamed on Facebook and on the State Library website. You can also join in the conversation using the hashtags on the screen. And I'd now like to hand over to Tony. Please welcome our guests.
Thank you, Louise, and we at Grattan certainly very much appreciate the relationship we've had with the State Library, and my personal excuse is I get to come back to Brisbane every now and again. Ian McFarlane is on his way. You may have seen a couple of us texting viciously before because he got stuck in the rain and his taxi got lost. We do not take that as a comment on the resources industry in Queensland at all. All right? Okay, one thing about Grattan, I'm going to cover some numbers because we sort of are obsessed about the data and like to think that we follow the numbers wherever it takes us. Sometimes it may take us in directions we didn't expect in the beginning. And then I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's going to cover some issues associated with more from her background. Peter Ashworth I've known for many years, and she is probably one of the world's experts in community engagement in a whole range of areas that are very important in this space. And then Ian McFarlane, as you know, is the head of the Queensland Resources Council and has a deep background in the politics of the resources industry. And if that doesn't give us enough to have a conversation about, then I don't know what will. And we'll have a short period of discussion amongst the three of us just to get things moving while you think about some comments, some questions you might have to ask in the last 25 minutes or so. We are starting 5 minutes late, but we'll try and get pretty close to 7:15 because we do like to finish on time as well. So, the first thing is, if you look at some of the numbers that are quoted by many people about what's going on in the future of coal, they talk about the International Energy Agency's analysis. And this chart comes from their most recent report that was published in December of last year, and you can see it has three scenarios. But they are at great pains to point out that these are not forecasts, even though some people choose to interpret them as forecasts. They are scenarios of what might happen if certain things play out, and they're very clear on what those things would be. So, for example, if we keep going the way we are, then under the current policies, coal demand globally will increase, which is the red line at the top. If we do what has already been committed to in relation to specific policies, then basically coal demand for the next 20 years, 25 years, 30 years will flatline. And finally, if we do what we need to do to be able to address what they call sustainable development or something consistent with the Paris Agreement, then you can see what that means for the future of coal. Now, broadly speaking, many people in the resources industry tend to quote the stated policies scenario and tend to ignore the green one. That's fine. If you think that's what's going to happen, then you can evolve your strategies that way. We just think that it would be at least prudent to think about what would happen if we actually did try and address climate change, because that's where the green line would take us. The right-hand part of this chart shows what that would mean for the change in the mix of primary energy. In our region, the numbers are actually quite different, somewhat. When you look at these numbers, for me at least, it was a small surprise to see how much China is changing and how little India is not, based upon these numbers. Now, again, that's not a comment on whether these governments are doing the right thing or the wrong thing. This is just the numbers that the International Energy Agency has put together based upon their analysis of the outlook for coal. And you can see there that the outlook for India in particular is most likely significant growth, and that may or may not continue. Some of you may have even seen that India only a couple of weeks ago announced that they were going to cease imports of thermal coal for their industry. Now, in 2014, the Indian government announced they were going to stop imports of thermal coal, and they did for a couple of years, and then it went back to where it was. So, again, that's not a comment on what the Indian government does, what it says or not. It's just interesting that I certainly wouldn't be putting too much weight on these numbers in terms of are these forecasts for what will happen, because each government has its own challenges to be faced, and India, of course, still has many, many people without even electricity, and you can understand where they're coming from at times. So looking briefly at, again, what's actually happening, this chart here shows you the number of new coal-fired power stations that are being built in the world by year, and you can see the top line there is the whole world. The one in the middle is China and India, and the bottom one is everybody else. And the interesting thing is, in the last year, the line that was seemed to be heading downwards over the last 3 or 4 years took a bit of an uptick. Not just China, although China contributed, but in particular a number of other countries in Asia where there was a number of coal-fired power stations were opened last year. Now, is that a trend? Is it a one-off? Who knows? But that's where the numbers are. More interestingly, when you combine those numbers with what's actually going on a net basis, some people ignore the fact that a number of countries, in particular China, has been closing coal-fired power stations as well as opening new ones, and they've been closing less efficient, more highly emitting coal-fired power stations, and that means that as they build the new ones, the emissions per megawatt hour of electricity are actually going down, and the amount of coal they need also goes down. So you can see here that the net result, even though again the new capacity line at the top did take that uptick, the bottom line, the retirements has been pretty flat. In terms of megawatts of capacity, and so you can see the net change, which was the sort of light yellowy colour in the middle there, which was heading pretty well towards zero, has taken a bit of an uptick, and we'll see what that means. Now, again, who knows what these numbers are going to do, because they're pretty, they move around quite a lot. And so I think it's anyone who thinks they can forecast with any precision what's going to happen. But I think, generally speaking, if we were going to do a trend analysis, you'd say most likely the trend is down in terms of the future of where coal for power stations is heading. I should point out, by the way, that Australia exports a lot of two forms of coal: metallurgical coal, which is used to produce steel, and thermal coal, which is used in power stations. The vast majority of our coal, of course, is exported, and so what happens to our coal industry is more dependent upon decisions that are made in Delhi and Beijing than decisions that are made in Canberra or Brisbane. And that's important when people are having a debate about what we should be doing about our own coal-fired power stations and our coal mines. So when you look at what's going on with the production, you see that there's a lot of uncertainties again. But interestingly, Australia, based upon these numbers, and this is the International Energy Agency, looks like, given if you accept the assumptions built into this, then Australia looks like it'll be one of the few countries whose production of coal will continue, or exports of coal will continue to be significant and grow. Not very dramatically, but certainly steadily. And that is based upon that stated policy scenario I mentioned at the beginning. So if that's what plays out, then Australia's coal exports would appear to be, at least for a while, fairly stable. And this chart, which comes from the Australian government's most recent quarterly index report on coal exports and other commodities, but the one for this year hasn't been published as yet, again shows a relatively benign output for coal, in this case coal exports. So when we look at all that, here are some of our conclusions. Firstly, I think if you look at the questions here is what do you think about in regards to how we should be planning our future? If you look at what happened in electricity when we had rapid change, the closure of the Hazelwood coal-fired power station in Victoria, that's when people get really upset because they lose their jobs, they're given no notice, change is rapid and life is difficult. On the other hand, if you have more time to plan, then you're more likely to get a more successful transition. The problem is that most of us don't like planning if we wish to deny that which against which we are planning. And that's where we are, I think, in some of this debate. Because unless you accept that, if you don't get past denial, then you can't possibly get to acceptance and planning. Ultimately, I think the data for us supports the argument that at the very least we should be allowing for the prospects that the outlook for coal exports for this country is broadly negative over the long term, and that we should be planning for that future. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, it doesn't mean it's going to happen with any particular time frame as far as I'm concerned, but it does mean we need to be planning for that future, because if we have a plan, then we're more likely to be able to accelerate or decelerate. If you haven't got a plan, then you're really stuck without accelerator or a brake, and that's not a very good place to be. I think the role of governments and the way they work with both, and I mean federal, state and local governments have a role in thinking about what a transition away from coal would mean. And I think we saw in the last federal election, both particularly in Queensland and New South Wales, there is what happens when a party tries to move people along without giving them some prospect of what's going to happen. I think people in many parts of those coal industries in Queensland and New South Wales concluded they didn't want to lose their jobs. Whether that was a vote against climate change is a very different question, I think. And I think that's where Labor probably got that wrong. So finally, I think we need a plan. And when we wanted to be engaging in a conversation about, well, if you accept at the very least that there's a trend here, then we need to be thinking about what might that plan look like, and how might that mean? Because it also is simple but true that renewable energy is not the plan. Renewable energy may very well be an underpinning of part of the plan, but renewable energy doesn't create many jobs. And certainly, and the bigger the renewable energy project, the fewer the jobs it creates in a sense, because the economies of scale are such. You don't need many people to clean solar panels. You don't need many people to look after wind turbines. And so you've got to think about what the alternatives might be. And I think that's where we need to turn our conversation. Look, I'll finish there and I'll hand over to Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight and allowing us to share some of our thoughts. As I said, I've been looking at public attitudes to climate energy for some time, and I wanted to start with this picture. It came from some colleagues down in the Victorian government, and I want to acknowledge Brendan who took the photo. This was the day that Hazelwood closed. And to me, it's a really important physical image around the human side of what we're talking about. And, hanging our hats on a worker transition, I think that one came in quite a surprise in some ways. And then what happened and the fallout, even as those communities start to recover, has been not quick. So I just wanted to start with that. And then I'm going to share some of just some research that we've been doing. This is actually calling on data actually from 2017. But I thought it's a nice way to put into context what I see some of the issues. So we did a nationally representative sample. This work was actually funded by ACALEP, the Australian Coal Association Law Mission, and the federal government and University of Queensland. We did a small social science project in a much larger technical one that was looking at carbon capture and storage. So this is really just to show you that it was representative, but we also chose to oversample in Queensland, in South Australia and Victoria. Queensland, from sort of Brisbane up to the Surat to Gladstone, South Australia where there was large renewable projects, and in Victoria around Hazelwood in the Gippsland. My thinking is that people have different contexts, and that influences their support and thoughts around technologies and their livelihoods. So this is just to show, I was doing research at CSIRO. Overall, the numbers haven't changed much. The majority of Australians think that climate change is an issue, that it's happening, or it will be happening. I was going to ask for a show of hands. It would be interesting to see what we think here in this room. But there's only a small number that sort of believe that it's an issue, and there's still a group that is confused. It hasn't changed. What I wanted to show here is just some averages, just the sort of spread of responses when we ask people around their support. Now, all you need to think about, it's a scale of 1 to 7. 1, you strongly disagree with the use of the technology. 7, you strongly agree. So the one on, is it your left? My left? I think it is your left. The general public is the broad overview, and then the others is where we start to sort of drill down. And why I did it in this way, really you can just see the shape of the histograms, is that when you look at the means, which are probably hard to see, and that's probably not so much, is that there are differences across those states. So this is levels of support for coal. And if you look South Australia, where we're in a strong renewable area, I strongly disagree. There's a strong leaning to the left. But if you look at Victoria, in the Gippsland area, people are far more tolerant. Queensland's a little bit in the middle. Coal seam gas. Look at the broad Australian on the left, and then it goes along again. So I'm not going to dwell on these, but it's just interesting, I think, to look at the shape and look at where people sit. And I encourage that when we start to look at numbers around support, that we look beyond the means to think about, well, what's really underpinning this? And where are the attitudes? So the first one there on the left is levels of support for gas. And notice the midpoint. You neither agree nor disagree. There's a whole group of people that probably don't necessarily engage in this or really don't know what the answer is. Carbon capture and storage, levels of support for gas or coal. Obviously it's a new technology, it's fairly unknown, and so we see a really large jump across the board in those that neither agree nor disagree. I'm not too sure. I wanted to put in nuclear and solar. The trend that you see, so nuclear is a very interesting one. It's a very divisive technology. I can remember back in 2006 when we were talking about that, we saw a real shift from people being 3 to 1 against when it was started to be talked about by the Howard government. It changed to 2 to 1 and people became more uncertain about it. But the trend that we see in those levels of support for solar PV, for renewables, is consistent, not only in Australia but around the world. If you have wind, it's a similar shape. So in the broad mix, people are very keen to support renewables as the long-term goal, I think. And I think there is an issue. Now here is just, again, it's a mass of numbers which we're not going to go into detail, but it starts to get to the idea of where some of these issues might be emerging in society. Particularly, I'll draw your attention to where it talks about the Coalition Liberal Party, the Coalition National Party. And what we've tried to do is summarise support in green. The asterisk means it's more significant, and obviously negative is in red, so opposition is in red. So if you look up at coal, if we go down the coal, let's have a look. So the minus red means that females tend to be less supportive. But if we look at the Liberal Party, strongly supportive of coal when we do our analysis. National Party, a little bit less. Australian Greens, not at all. So you can start to see, and what was really interesting for me was the Labor Party in this didn't come through, this sort of swinging voter preference which came. It was really interesting. And if you go to the other end of wind and solar, it's the opposite. I really just wanted to start that just to sort of get you thinking about what plays out in society. And then I've been very fortunate in my life, I think, to work with a fabulous person, Emeritus Professor Cindy Gower, who's a social psychologist. And she taught me everything I know early on around these different theories that I bring to this. So social identity theory, it predicts certain intergroup behaviours on the basis of perceived group status differences, legitimacy and stability of those differences, and the ability to move. So if I asked you, which groups do you identify? Voting preferences is one. Are there sporting groups that you belong to? There's a book club or whatever. Each of these shapes our identity of who we are. And that's very important to us, and it's very important to the conversations that we have. What else? In-group and out-group bias. And I'm sure we've all been guilty of this, particularly when you're young, but we happen to even do it when we're old. So what we do is we give preferential treatment to those that are in our same group because we want to reinforce our beliefs. And today in this information world, you can seek out any information to reinforce your position. All right? And the ones that are out-group, the ones that think differently from you, well, they don't know what they're talking about. You know, we don't want to hear from them because they've got no idea. Think about what happens in your daily lives, about different times when someone's actually disagreed with you and how you've responded. Is it because they're challenging your group think, your group bias? And then group think, and this I think is one of the most dangerous things that we are, you know, most society, these are strong psychologically researched theories, is that when we're involved in a cohesive group, the need to conform overrides any of that idea to challenge the status quo. And that, I think, is probably one of the most dangerous things when we're thinking about this transition. Because we actually need the person that's brave enough within a group that we all identify in to speak out and actually go, no, hang on a minute, we perhaps need to look at this differently. And actually, I heard something yesterday that I want to bring into the group and I think we need to talk about. So I just wanted to underpin that, to think about why this discussion becomes so tricky and that it's not easy when we think about people. And in my world, in the work that I've been doing, also I look after the Master of Sustainable Energy. We've got 26 different countries that have been represented in the Masters. It's not just about the world that we live in here, particularly sitting in the lovely State Library of Brisbane. The Northern Territory inquiry into fracking. The one down the bottom was Barrendrek, where they were opposed to carbon capture and storage. And this man stood up in front of the two environment ministers saying, we do not want this, period. But then you look at Papua New Guinea, and this I credit my colleague Mark Moran, you know, using solar panels as best they can to do their homework, or the gender issues. So it's challenging. But my takeaway is that I think we are in a transition, but not everybody wants to acknowledge this, and we don't necessarily want to pay for it. I'm really keen to do some research around post where we're up now based on what's happened, but it's also probably not ethical at the moment to go and ask people their thoughts around climate and so forth. I think one of the biggest threats to projects are individual concerns about what's going to happen to our livelihoods and lifestyles. Understandably, especially in regional. I grew up in country WA and I know what's happening in regional areas, and I think it's important to think about it. But it's all about the trade-offs. And sort of building on what Tony says, I think we have to start the plan, thinking about what the future might hold and bringing people along. But we somehow have to think about our differences, recognise those, put them aside and work collaboratively. I don't know if that helps with this discussion, but I thought I'd throw that in.
Okay, we might, obviously the taxi's going around the block again. We'll see how we go with Ian being able to get here. But hopefully there's enough material there to begin a conversation, and then we can open it up a little bit. And I did, by the way, I have got some questions that were submitted before this, and what I've tried to do, there were some common themes around those questions. So if you'll forgive me, I've grouped some of them together so we can concentrate on the issues that are coming out. And if you don't recognise your question, it may be because I've hidden it inside another one. So one of the things that has caused us to think a lot in the last year or so about this idea of this transition, in fact, was done Lucy Percival, who's sitting in here this evening, and when she was working at Grattan last year, did some really interesting analysis that looked at the voting patterns in key seats across Australia, but in particular in areas where you might define them being high levels of carbon-intensive jobs. And that includes coal mining, coal-fired power stations, aluminium, other industries where there's a significant exposure to that. And there's a very significant, not absolutely causal, but a very significant correlation between those jobs and their voting patterns in the election last year. And that played out pretty clearly, and we saw that in Queensland, and we saw it to some extent in the Hunter region. And if we don't think about that, and if our political leaders don't think about that, then I think we're going to run into trouble before we can think about a sensible transition. Ian, Good timing. Thank God you're here.
I almost went home.
So, Ian has seen the presentations that both Peter and I were using, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at them and you know a lot of what we said. So we can pick up from there. But I guess to summarise, I was looking at some of the numbers that talk about where the coal industry has been, what the IEA says about the future of coal demand in the world, and what's been going on with some of the growth and closures of coal-fired power stations, and what that means in terms of how do we think about where things go next. And Peter was talking about some of the interesting challenges from a sociological perspective as to how we think about the future of various technologies and what that might mean as a community, both in government, community and industry. So maybe from your perspective, from the Resources Council, you might want to pick up how you and your organisation see the challenge of where coal, and then we can come back to the sort of discussion and questions.
Okay, well, there's no doubt that global demand for coal will fall. How quickly it falls depends entirely on Asia. Europe is moving away from coal, Australia's moving away from coal. As Tony may have said, in terms of Australia's power generation, we'd like to move more to gas, but because of political impediments, you could say political bastardry in New South Wales and Victoria, their gas fields aren't being developed, and as a consequence there just isn't enough gas for large-scale gas power generation. So the gap is being filled as best it can with renewables, with some coal-fired power stations closing down like Liddell and phase through, and likely within 15 to 20 years all coal-fired power stations will be closed. What is generating that baseload then? That's literally the $64,000 question. That's not going to be the case in Europe. In Asia, and it's not the case in Japan, where Japan is building power stations that are reliant on high quality, high energy coal, particularly out of Australia and in particular out of New South Wales. So how long does coal demand in Asia go? I think Tony put a slide up there that said 20 years before you see it falling away. So what's that mean for Australia? Well, it basically means that we continue on our path to renewables. We continue to try and secure some form of baseload. I'm sort of ever optimistic at some point that someone will have a rational discussion about nuclear. That's an area of zero emission, new technology that will supply endless baseload power. The problem we have with renewables is maintaining its synchronous in the grid. So you get out of synchronisation. You have situations like you had a few weeks ago, where South Australia had to be isolated from the grid for fear that it would disrupt the grid. So you need the synchronisation. You obviously need it when you have days like today and solar's not generating. You have days a bit like today because there hasn't been for most of the day a lot of wind around. So you do need that baseload component. I guess along with a more optimistic view on nuclear, think that gap is going to come from gas. There is ample gas supply in Victoria and New South Wales to supply that. It's how they make that transition, how they get past the political impediments of the Andrews government and the activists in the Narrabri region who are preventing that being developed. At the same time, in Queensland will continue to supply high quality, high thermal content coal into the Asian market, and so we should, because if we don't, then that coal will be substituted with lower quality, higher CO2 emissions, higher sulphur dioxide emissions, coal that's mined with far less environmental conditions, let alone rehabilitation conditions, and coal that is, as I say, an inferior quality. So Queensland should be the last place in the world they mine coal. we mine coal, because we have the best quality, we have the strongest environmental conditions, we have, and these are Jackie Tradd's words, not mine, we have the strongest rehabilitation laws in the world, we have strong and about to be even stronger workplace health and safety laws. So whilst there is a global demand, it makes sense to satisfy that demand, because we can only cover the sovereign issues of our own country. It makes sense to satisfy that demand from Australia and ensure that if countries like India, like Malaysia, Japan, whoever, require thermal coal, and they do because they're building those power stations today, then that coal be supplied from Australia. That said, the Queensland resources industry is not dependent on thermal coal. We are a metallurgical coal mining state. Nearly 70% of our production is metallurgical. There is no known substitute for that. I did, when I was minister, put $100 million into a project in Western Australia to try and turn iron ore into steel with lower emissions, and that project still sits as a monument to that project, to that idea failing. That was high smelt, by the way. But for Queensland, the future really lies not only in metallurgical coal, but obviously in all the minerals that surround the renewable energy industry, whether it's copper, where they rely on 4 times as much copper for an electric car than you do with a conventional vehicle, whether it's the vanadiums, the lithiums, those metals that we can and will produce to satisfy that growing renewable energy demand. And of course aluminium, which is very much a part of that and our modern future. So it's what's the future for coal in Australia? Limited. In Asia, no one's really sure. In Europe, no doubt they're on the same trajectory, although their renewables uptake isn't as high as ours. They're on the same trajectory as us.
Okay, so can I, couple of questions that I think we should tease out and then go to the audience. If you look at those numbers, Ian, and I think, as you said, I made a comment that, look, in terms of what happens, given we export so much of our coal, and you accept that over the next 20 or 30 years, the existing coal-fired power stations will close. And in Australia, and most of those, it's unlikely, although it's possible, that a coal-fired power station gets built in Australia again, but it seems unlikely. Then the decisions on what happens to our thermal coal will be made, as you said, I think in Asia, and I made the point, they'll be made in Beijing and Delhi rather than being made in Melbourne or Brisbane.
Absolutely.
So you've either got to then say, okay, well, the world is going to, the countries we're talking about will continue to use thermal coal because their view they need to, and they will therefore largely ignore or take an exception to or whatever the International Paris Agreement, which they've signed up.
I don't think they ignore it. I mean,
how do you think you reconcile? How do you reconcile that? That's my point. I'm not saying they will or not, but if they do what the Paris Agreement says, then isn't your hypothesis more likely to be that they will turn away from coal more quickly than some of the other numbers suggest?
Well, I mean, what they're saying at the moment is that this is their time to develop. The developed countries like Australia, Europe, etc., America, have done their development. They still have a phase of development they need to go through. Energy is crucial to that. They'll use an energy mix. They'll use a higher renewable proportion than any country did 50 years ago, but they'll still emit huge amounts of CO2. I mean, you put the slide up, coal production in China is 5 times that of Australia, 5 times that of Indonesia, etc. So countries like China are going to increase their proportion of renewables, but still use probably much the same amount of coal as they're using now. The amount of electricity consumed will grow. The amount of electricity as a percentage produced from coal will fall, but the number of gigawatt hours produced from coal in China will remain relatively static. Much the same in India, much the same in most of the Southeast Asia. So that coal demand is going to be there. Is that going to change? I don't see the will amongst those countries to do it. Australia can only do what Australia can do. If we don't supply the coal, they'll get it from somewhere else, as I've been through that argument. Australia needs to look in its own backyard and do what we're doing. And, you know, I think, Tony, it's worth reflecting on the effort that I made with when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister to actually get a bilateral, bipartisan agreement on reducing emissions. That didn't happen for a whole range of reasons, which I won't bore the audience with, but it did mark the weaponisation of emission reduction as a political weapon. And since then, getting bipartisan agreement in Australia has been impossible. That said, I think we're on a better trajectory than, say, India or China in terms of increasing our proportion. So I think we are going to live it. It's going to be two parallel universes. We're going to have strong demand for coal in Asia for at least 20 years, by which time you would expect all close to all coal-fired power stations in Australia will have closed.
And so we might want to come back to that.
And that won't affect the coal industry in particular in Queensland, because the vast bulk of our demand is international, vast bulk.
Sure. And as you said, the met coal issue is a very different question. I'd like to come back to that one as well. But if you look at that, where that leads you in terms of the debate in Australia, as you said, it didn't turn out well back then, and it hasn't improved ever since.
It's probably got worse since.
Well, yeah, maybe, and yeah, I suspect you're right. And I think the current, I mean, presumably sometime relatively soon, the government will announce the technology roadmap, which is, I would say facetiously somewhat, it's the policy you have when you don't have a policy. But the idea is that we're going to invest in technology and drive down emissions that way, expecting that for some reason that will be cheaper than putting a price on emissions. But I guess I'd be interested in, do you see, from the perspective of the resources sector, the technologies emerging or the potential there for technology, and I guess, and Peter as well, that are likely to address this lower emissions challenge, whether it be hydrogen, whether it be renewables. You made the point about nuclear, because at the moment it does seem that there's an unresolved debate. People will say, like, we'll just solve it with batteries, but there's an unresolved debate as to how do you actually deal with powering cities like Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne with wind and solar when we really don't have the capacity to do that with storage as yet. So how do you see that debate playing out? Is it going to have to be some sort of technology thing, because it's not going to be led by policy for the reasons we've just been talking about? Peter, what do you think about that?
So I think we do have a little bit of hope looking forward, but it's an interesting, we've all worked on carbon capture and storage as one of those solutions, but looking forward, having been part of the hydrogen strategy group, that's a long-term vision of perhaps maybe over time we can look at using that, and when renewables aren't being utilised during the day where there's a surplus, that could be used to produce it. There's the discussion of the coal and gas with CCS to make hydrogen as well. So I guess there is some hope that some of these in the whole world. I think the other thing that's interesting, having been to China a few times now, and yes, definitely seeing the more efficient coal-fired power, but there is also a little bit of a stop on, they've got approval for this, but we're not allowed to build it and so forth. So we are seeing a slowing down. And then the role of finance of coal projects and things, I'm interested to think about that, because we are seeing definitely there's different sort of shareholders.
It's no longer coal, no longer just coal. I mean, we're now seeing resistance to financing gas.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's an
I
interesting...
don't know what the substitute is if you knock those two out.
I know, and I think, gas has often been seen as that transition because it is cleaner than coal overall from the emissions profile point of view. But I think that's an interesting play that I'm yet to really understand the role, because even, we're talking about you need rail to take coal out, actually getting joint venture to finance some of these is becoming difficult. So where does that put, from the world stage, the pressure from Europe and so forth in some of these things is something that I'm interested in as well.
Yes, I mean, we've done a bit of work over the years on this whole question of the role of government in technology, and it seems to me that if you wanted someone to pick the winning technology, I wouldn't choose government to do that. But you may have a different view, Ian.
I don't. I mean, if you go back and remember why I was involved in those discussions, it's because the easiest route was to put a price on carbon. In 2010, we almost, and John Howard went to an election in 2007 working towards that. I mean, we had a decade of bipartisanship on energy and emissions policy. So our government introduced the renewable energy target in 2001. I was the minister who administered that as the energy minister. We had through until 2007. We then we went to an election looking at pricing carbon and all the things that went with that, and emission reduction. We lost that election. Kevin Rudd was elected. 2009, 2010. We were still almost there as a bipartisan force, and then it just flew to bits. So if we go back to your point, pricing carbon will drive the technologies. It's as simple as that. It will make the decisions as to whether carbon capture, which, pick a number, $90 to $130 a tonne US, and hopefully your source is close to your deposit, and hopefully you've got some oil recovery to supplement that. Makes it hard for Australia, but they'll work on it. Hopefully we can get the price of hydrogen down, which is currently, pick a number, 10 to 15 times the cost of conventional energy. And hydrogen is the great white hope. But in the meantime, why aren't we considering Gen 3, Gen 4 nuclear reactors? So I think the best way to drive those decisions is always have a price and let business or enterprise make up its mind. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. So I guess the second alternative is government does it.
Well, we're doomed to continue to flail around in this space, and eventually we'll come back where we should have started when you were involved.
Yeah, well, I hope we do come back sooner rather than later, because you'll get no resolution of this issue, whether it's energy security, cost of supply, emissions reduction. You'll get no long-term solutions while ever there is the risk that at the next election the government will change and the whole policy will change.
No, that's a particularly difficult problem in Australia, I think. Sorry, Pete.
Well, I'm just looking at, the price of solar has come down considerably, and I think they're the things we've seen, the learning curves. The price of batteries and storage has actually dropped quite considerably in a very short space of time. So from a science perspective, even though I'm not a technical, I think there's sort of hope around some of that, and guess this idea of where hydrogen could fit as well, because not only from the energy but also transport and things. And and I guess it depends on what the end goal is too, but if we are committed to climate and reducing emissions, I think, that's where there needs to be this sort of discussion. I wonder after, as we've been through the terrible time in January with the bushfires, that actually the Australian public are probably more open to thinking around that, we do need to place a value on the environment, and we do need to think about what that might be, and whether it's a way that that's communicated, I'm not sure. But I live in hope that actually that's part of this transition that we need to go through.
I think there's some areas where you can see that you could drive down the technology to the point where it may be cheaper than the non-low emissions, the higher emissions technology, right? So renewable energy is potentially one of those when you think about the actual cost of the electricity itself, the megawatt hours. There are others where because you're having to do something extra to reduce the emissions, there's a cost, and that will always be the case. So CCS has always been in that space. If you don't put a value on the benefit you get from CCS, then it's going to be always harder to get CCS to, even if it comes down in cost dramatically, unless you put some price on it, then I don't see how you ever do it. And to some extent, hydrogen is the same. I mean, because, you can produce, hydrogen, you can do things with hydrogen, but you can do them with other things as well. And until you really want to do those things with the hydrogen, it's hard to see how that works. I mean, hydrogen, you'll see the technology roadmap, and Angus Taylor in a speech Friday a week ago made some comments. I think his H2 needs to be 2 or something like that. Another slogan.
$2 a kilogram.
Pardon?
Hydrogen needs to be $2.
Yeah, $2 a kilogram. Now, $2 a kilogram hydrogen translates into about $13 or $14 a gigajoule of energy. So it's not obscenely expensive.
The gas price today is $2.50.
Yeah, so it's more cheaper than gas, right? It's more expensive than gas. gas has been up in that territory, of course, in recent times in Australia. So hydrogen's got some ways to go.
But that's the goal. That's not the price at the
Correct.
moment.
No, the price now is more like $4 or
$30.
$5 a kilo. And the aspect, take Peter's point about solar. If we put the effort into it, maybe we'll find.
And we'll make advances on batteries. And batteries don't mean batteries; they mean pump hydro. Sure. I saw a bit of technology today about compressing air and then using the release of that air to generate electricity. So that's just another form of battery. Battery technology is where we've got to make the leaps and bounds so that when we have 3 days like we've just had and the sun doesn't shine, you've actually got all that solar energy you've generated in the last week stored up somewhere. You can't do it with lithium-ion batteries.
No.
And I think that's also a view for the hydrogen too, that can actually be stored, and you could potentially, if you got to that view longer term, that you could call it back on those days as a longer option to the
I guess that comes back to your point though, isn't it? That the idea that we'll just pick a technology. This isn't a problem. There are plenty of technologies. The issue is to provide the incentive for people to go and find those technologies themselves. So can we open up to you, the audience? Can I ask, please, could you try and ask a question? And resist making a long speech. And secondly, it'd be useful if you could identify yourself as to, do you have an affiliation with any organisation? Sorry, Peter.
And I just wanted to say, one of the things in my work as a social scientist is this role of the public and the general public getting on board with what do we need to do. And we've always talked about this, that, do people here, are they familiar with how hydrogen's produced, or do you understand carbon? How important, because everyone's busy doing their day-to-day. So my challenge is, how do we get people to engage more in these discussions, to be challenged in their in and out groups, to think about what really needs to happen, because I think that then feeds back into bottom up towards policymakers, to governments, to be able to make the stronger decisions that we need, as you talked about, actually having a goal. Because while there's this marginal discussions and people aren't prepared to trade off, so I'm interested in how we manage to do that more as well, because I think that can help.
I think, though, we shouldn't overthink that point. I mean, nearly everyone drives a car. Probably less than 10% understands how it works, and
I know.
less than
There's
1%.
always this trade-off.
So I
of
think
things,
if the goal is reduce
we need
emissions
a government to make decisions
and keep electricity affordable and reliable, I think it's a pretty clear.
Yeah, no, I agree. Sorry.
Okay, so
Perfect world.
we've got 2 microphones, so we can maybe we start over this. Yep. Okay, got.
Yes, I've got a question. What do you think about Vina Energy's Wandoan solar project with the battery grid storage energy thing that's going on at Wandoan inland from Gympie?
Sorry, what was the last bit?
Wandoan?
Yeah,
the best. What do you think about that as a project? It's focusing on battery grid scale energy storage, and they're working on it in conjunction with AGL.
Yeah. Well, AGL have got a number of renewable projects out there already, and our industry supports those projects. We only have one reservation about them, and that is that prime agricultural land is not sterilised by solar panels, and that I'm not saying that should affect the number of projects, just affects where you site them, because there's ample room out there to build 20 Wandoans. That reservation aside, and it's not the case at Wandoan, by the way, then we need more of those projects, and we need them sited the way the project's sited at Wandoan, which is close to the interconnector. So it has that advantage. What we have seen in the past, and I'm guilty of funding 2 of those projects, one at Ningen and one at Broken Hill. Again, AGL are the offtake company. Those projects are at the end of the grid and not in a position to dispatch all their energy. And so you see in the case of Broken Hill, for instance, there are plenty of days where they dispatch less than 25% of their capacity. So if we are going to build these solar farms, they've got to be close to the interconnector. In Queensland's case, we've done a much better job of that than other states. So we've got not just Wandoan, but we've got established solar farms west of Dalby, Chinchilla, in that area. And the interesting, or the neat thing about that is that they're being supplemented by gas-fired generation which is also in that area. So we're able to use the same infrastructure to generate renewable when we can, top it up with gas when we need to. So those sorts of projects are going to become more commonplace. Queensland is leading the way in terms of solar. We've got a bit of catching up to do on wind, which is more to do with their wind mapping, but again, AGL are well through their Cooper's Gap project, and we'll see more of those projects coming on.
Thank you. Vicky Ullman, a Sustainable Communities Researcher with the University of Sunshine Coast. Ian, I guess that this question is for you. We're talking about transition here and a process of social change at a range of different levels, from industry, workers, the Resources Council, etc. I've been thinking about the word resources and whether it's possible to reframe that as being broader than mineral resources. And so I'm wondering whether the market signals are reaching our energy companies in Australia, BHP, Santos, Origin, etc., and whether they're thinking we need to diversify with our range of energy sources, including hydro and wind and solar and so forth. That might mean, that's just my little dream, that workers won't lose their jobs in those communities and that there is a transition to another form of resource use for them. And that changes the way then they see coal, that it is simply one of the resources that they might have training in. They might be working somewhere else on a different energy source in the future. It's a dream, it's a pipe dream, but, interested to see what you think.
I'm not sure it's a dream. It's happening now, and companies are diversifying. And if you look at our own, at the companies who, take Rio Tinto, for instance, who've installed a huge renewable energy facility up in Weipa, and that saves them burning diesel in that case. But a lot of our companies, and resource companies right around Australia, gas companies even, are looking at how they can produce energy from solar in their location. So we see that diversity, and companies, BHP is a good example. Companies like BHP mine just about everything, from fertiliser through to hard coking coal. So that those companies are looking at that diversity. In terms of the people who work in those industries, as I said earlier, the first of those to be affected will be those who work in power stations that are fired by black coal. And in Queensland, those transitions are going to be much later than in other states, because Queensland has the most efficient, lowest emitting black coal and the youngest fleet generators. So you're going to see that transition start, particularly in Victoria, where it's already started with Hazelwood, but work its way up the coast. But in time, those people will transition out. But they're already, if you're operating a mine in central Queensland now, you're about to learn how to do that sitting in an air-conditioned office, hopefully in Moorumba, and operating 3 or 4 dump trucks or 3 or 4 excavators, which is the modern way that mining's going. So you're then you then got a skill set to go into a whole range of industries, not just mining. So that transition is happening at the moment.
I think the other thing about the renewable energy in particular is that if you're mostly talking about solar and wind, they don't actually create many jobs. And so the biggest challenge we have, I think, in some parts of the country is if we're thinking about this transition, even if it is taking place, whether you think it's taking place over the next 10 years or the next 30 years, you've still got to be thinking, it seems to me, about what that looks like. And one of the interesting questions is, are there opportunities where in a world of the sort we're talking about, Australia might have an advantage? And Ross Garnaut's written about this in his book Superpower, that Australia may very well have an advantage in low-cost renewable energy from which we could produce hydrogen to make stuff. Now, whether or not that takes us back to Australia being a manufacturer of stuff, again, as opposed to an exporter of raw materials, we'll see, but that's an interesting possibility there, and it may be that one of the things that hydrogen can do is provide that avenue in certain areas, And there are technologies, and Ian referred to one before, that at the time didn't go very far, but is being revisited and goes to direct reduction of iron ore to produce iron. Now, that needs very cheap hydrogen and therefore very cheap renewable energy to make it work, but that could actually create quite a few jobs. So that's where we have to be thinking, because I think exporting hydrogen or producing more renewable energy is unlikely to create the jobs that would replace those we have today, it seems to me.
I think that's part of the goal, isn't it? That it's a hubs and spokes, that it actually happens in the regions, that production, and that those people could perhaps those capabilities transfer.
And you've got in places like central Queensland, coastal Queensland and the Hunter region, which is where there's significant concentration of these jobs. There's also a lot of other significantly valuable resources, like the people and their skills, like the ports, the other infrastructure, the railways and so forth, and the electricity transmission lines, they can be reutilised in a different sort of a world. Yes. Here, sorry.
Peter, I'm just passionately interested in the future of energy in Australia. And thank you, Tony and Peter and Ian, for your information that you've given, especially in relation to reducing emissions. Peter, I was very interested in the sociological and psychological aspect of the situation. I started thinking about people living in echo chambers and hearing what they want to hear, not with what is helping me. I was not surprised at your graft in relation to nuclear power. It's obvious what's happening there. The government is spending our money, almost 75 billion on the NBN, $250 billion on 12 substandard diesel-powered submarines, of which the first will not be delivered.
Well, don't start me on that. I'll be here all night.
15 billion on the Snowy 2.0 that is predicted to cost more to operate than save with the cost of energy. Yet the main reason given by governments not to invest in nuclear energy is that it'll be too expensive. To me, that's ridiculous. Other than Australia has a non-nuclear policy, nuclear energy offers the only solution to the energy trilemma. That is security and reliability, affordability and environmental sustainability. And in the summary of the latest paper that Grattan put out, the last sentence talks about people benefiting from security, reliability, affordability and environmental sustainability. And this is in relation to...
So your question is why not?
My question, I'm getting there. Furthermore, I believe that the research into the use of much safer and significantly greener, and I've actually emailed you on this, Tony, thorium should be happening in Australia. My question is the situation concerning nuclear energy and energy policy in Australia is because of government irresponsibility and lack of political will, or fear of losing votes?
Who wants to start?
Well,
it's a very interesting question.
I'm more than happy to welcome to that one. Look, I think it's very difficult to separate some of these issues you've mentioned, and politicians make decisions with a whole range of things that many of us don't necessarily appreciate, and sometimes might prefer they didn't, but that's their job. And so when we make recommendations on policy, we might get annoyed when governments don't think about what we've suggested, but we understand the world they live in. I think the question for nuclear is twofold. One is, I think, under what circumstances would this position with nuclear change today? Because as you've seen from the numbers, you can do surveys, and sometimes you find surprisingly strong support for nuclear, depending on, I think, to some extent, how you ask the question.
Yes,
but age. So there's a whole range of things here. Now,
gender.
We have the potential. I think there's two things that have to change. One would be that as we move towards higher levels of wind and solar, particularly, we're now between 20 and 25% renewable energy, and Ian was very much involved in the policy that delivered that, the federal government's renewable energy target. New South Australia is already at 50% renewables, but the problem in South Australia, the challenge for South Australia is that at times it's also, whilst it may be exporting at more than 100% of its energy to Victoria, other times it's importing. because the wind isn't blowing at certain times, and it has gas as the backup. As Victoria also moves in that same direction, and does New South Wales, and does Queensland, then what does that look like? And does it become increasingly very difficult? Now, there are technologies and we talked a bit about hydrogen, we've talked a little bit about storage that could solve that problem. But if it doesn't, because I don't think it's yet a compellingly correct answer, then is nuclear an alternative? That's the first question. But the second question that I think also has to be answered is can we actually look towards inherently safe nuclear power, particularly small modular reactors? And Alan Finkel, those of you who may have seen his most recent speech at the National Press Club, talked about these. He said, look, we know how to make these things. They're in submarines and aircraft carriers. We just probably wouldn't stick them out in suburbs yet. Now, if you can develop the technologies, and they are under development, to produce them in factories and drive down the costs and make them inherently safe, and maybe thorium is the right way to go, then that would seem to me to be the second part. So if we had a situation where Plan A becomes increasingly challenging and the cost of Plan B comes down significantly, then I could see that world changing as we have to grapple with that's not my most likely future, but I can see a circumstance in which that would happen.
It's a divisive technology. The most people that support it are educated older males. There is a group of young environmentalists who are starting to see that nuclear has a role from a carbon, low CO2. Eric McFarlane, who was here for a couple of years, Harvard-trained MD and a nuclear physicist, he was the one that got me over the line. I was the typical woman that was like, oh no, I don't like nuclear, but having worked in the space and concerned about climate, I absolutely see that it has a role. But at the flip side of that is the contention that it creates, the divisiveness. In Sydney at the moment, the International Youth Nuclear Conference is on. There's people from all around the world that weren't affected by COVID actually talking about this, and it's a young youth movement that works with ANSTO, but then also policy to do that takes a long time, which adds to the cost, and then also any leftover waste. I won't remind Ian of radioactive waste and trying to dispose of it, which causes...
No, we've actually come to a solution on that. And all we were trying to do was, and when I say we, I mean it's been a succession of resource ministers, but it now looks like we've got a site for a repository in South Australia. But all of that material is, of course, nuclear medicine derived. Some small portions, very, very small portions. So people have actually lived because of that waste. But I mean, as we move forward, and thorium's a little bit like hydrogen. It's the great wide hope that will solve our problems, and let's hope it does. But there are small generators and small modular generators, and they are inherently safe. It's just a case of getting them across the line. Australia would have been, in my opinion, moving towards nuclear by now if it weren't for Fukushima. What happened at Fukushima? Why did they build a nuclear power station in a tsunami zone and put the backup generators under the floor? Because that's the Westinghouse design. Where were they designed for? The Midwest of America, long way from the tsunami zone. So, there are ways around those issues. I wouldn't have been building in a tsunami zone in the first place, but you could have resolved it much better because the power station was actually intact after the tsunami, other than that it lost its power. And then, of course, the rest happened. So there are ways to make it work. And it is a psychological argument. It's not a science argument.
So ANSTO, I mean, is a good example.
ANSTO
Lucas Heights in Sydney, where there's
recently
a nuclear
in the
reactor.
middle of the Prime Minister's electorate, but due to a boundary change, it's no longer there. It's there, but the boundary's changed. But Lucas Heights has been operating in the outer suburbs of Sydney for 40 years. So
It's going to be a long conversation, I think. In the middle here, yes.
So my name is Marcus. I moved from Germany to Australia 10 years ago. And looking at this beautiful country and the conditions here in this country, I think we've got a huge potential with regard to transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energies. I think all the conditions are available. I also do not believe that we will be having if we plan for it, that we will be having a problem with transitioning jobs from any fossil fuel related industries to renewable energies. I don't think that's a problem.
I don't either.
My question here is, exporting coal creates a massive income stream for our country. In your introduction, you said you're developing policies in these planning scenarios. Do you consider and do you also plan around for where is the income for our country come from if we no longer export coal? Where is that money coming from in the future?
I think that's the... if Australia was a business, then that would be a central part of your business strategy, I think. Even if you took a view that it was going to be the next 20 years or more, then you'd be having a plan for what happens if the customers don't want to buy our product anymore. And these are, coal and gas now are very substantial parts of our export revenue. It seems to me that one of the areas we need to be actively looking at is do we have unusual... If you look around the world, there are very few parts of the world that have high levels of both wind and solar in more or less the same broad areas. And that becomes important if you're worried about the intermittency of wind and solar. Now, that still doesn't solve the problem. Australia, northwest of China, northern Africa are areas where that's particularly good. Now, it's a bit like other resources. I mean, there's not that many countries that have the same level of coal and gas that Australia has. We may very well can do things with that. That was my point before about the potential for turning that into a manufacturing industry and an export industry, not just another energy superpower. That's where I think the potential future could lie, and others think the same thing, but I don't know whether you, Ian or Peter, you have a view about that.
I think it's a big challenge. How do we move off the royalties that are generated? But I think it has to be thought about. Interestingly, we run that scenario with my master's students, and we actually show the exports and things, and they work away in groups, people from around the world, and when they come back to present, and it was actually the weekend before the last election, and so they said, we had someone from DRET do, this is coal policy, we'll take it to them, whoever's elected. And in each of those, pretty much every group said, we'll keep exporting metallurgical coal, we'll close down our thermal here, and then we'll start to invest in new technologies. And this sort of nuclear came up, which was quite interesting for me, because obviously they're all here to think about the transition to renewable energy, but just dealing with it. So I think it's again this discussion that we have to have around what is it, what are the things that we transition to.
I mean, the challenge that Australia is facing now, and I've got a bit of a bias in this area. I was the guy who tried to get the car industry to survive. I gave them 4.3 billion with a B dollars. We don't manufacture, we don't export a lot of our manufacturing. I'm chairman of the Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre in Melbourne. We've got $140 million worth of projects. We're doing some incredibly amazing, world-leading work in producing products. But are we replacing, in Queensland's case, $70 billion worth of resources exports? Not within a bull's roar of it. It's, it is such a huge part of Australia's economy that to work out what we're going to do to replace it, what are we good at if we're not mining? We're good at services, we're good at financial services, we're good at aged care services, tourism industry, those service industries. But there's a limit on how much you can export them. So unless we want to shrink back into an island economy and basically lower our living standards and not buy in finished products, there's a massive, massive challenge there, and no government is addressing it. No government, I can't say I addressed it, I had a big swing at it, but since 2012, 13, no government's been addressing it. So I think Australia does have to think about what do we do next, but the good news is it's probably still 30 to 40 years away at a bare minimum. The demand for copper, the demand for aluminium, the demand for lithium, the demand for the new rare earths is going to be there, and Australia's very efficient at producing them. So it's not all bleak. I have a lot of difficulty in thinking that people won't be using iron ore. They will be using it, but they may process it into steel in a different way.
But I think there's not... it's hard to see how we won't have steel, but I think we could produce steel from iron ore in different ways, which may reduce the
Yeah,
emissions.
and I agree.
That's where I think
But we'll still be exporting iron ore.
Well, maybe not. Why not convert the iron ore into iron in Australia?
Well, if we get the technology first.
That's my
But
challenge.
we also
for us.
have to think about the bright new minds and the new science and things as well. And I think there's a hope in some of this. I mean, that's where we need to start thinking about the investing in innovation and how do we move
Indeed.
the cost. And I think we can't, forget about that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Hi, I'm Xenia, a process engineer from Hatch, and my question is around, you've touched a little bit upon it, the jobs and the transition and the manufacturing in Australia. So with renewable energy, I see a big opportunity of actually producing the solar panels, the wind farms here in Australia, but also dealing with the waste, because just like nuclear, renewable has also its own waste, and mining from that waste and reusing those metals. Is there an opportunity, is there thought around it, and do you see an opportunity for that in Australia? And could that replace the jobs in mining? And is there any thought around it?
We've often said, as the cars close down, wouldn't it be good if that could become a recycling for what's going to come with all the solar panels and those sorts of things. There is a trial, I think, some stuff that's going on somewhere here in Queensland at the moment. I mean, but then again, it's at what cost and how does that happen? And it has to be built in, because at the moment, a lot of those things around the world are just being left. And so we do need to think about that from the point of view of circular economy and how we close the loop.
But there have been some examples where things, for example, in the steel industry, in many countries now, significant proportion, more than well over 50% of the steel doesn't come from iron ore, it comes from recycled steel. So people are seriously now engaging in designing products that can be recycled, and automotive manufacturers are probably the ones who've been taking a bit of a lead on that. So, I think the idea of doing that with wind farms and solar farms becomes an interesting question, because there's a lot of stuff there, and the life cycle of a wind farm is actually a lot shorter than the life cycle of a coal-fired power station. So we may see that emerging. I think we have time for one more question, and then we might. Someone got the microphone there. We lost the microphone. No.
Just quickly, we did have a solar manufacturer in Sydney, but it closed down in the mid.
Many years
a long
ago,
time ago.
yeah.
It was at Olympic Park.
Yeah,
Closed down 2004-05.
Yeah.
We did also have a wind turbine manufacturer, although that was being manufactured from components in northern Tasmania at Burnie. I think they're making mining equipment in that factory now. It closed down in about 2006. It's being able to compete against China. If you've got labour at the price that China's got, you can compete, but that's why we're uncompetitive. It's not the technology.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think the wages of people who currently work in these industries we're concerned about are very high. And, Australia, we are fortunate to live in a high-wage country, but there are consequences of that. Yes, the last question.
You were talking about not having a way of making steel from without using the metallurgical coal. But in fact, there's a company called ThyssenKrupp and another one in Norway, SAB, and so Europe is really Europe is really getting into this, using hydrogen to convert the iron ore into steel. In fact, SSAB is saying that they'll be using hydrogen in their factories by 2026, so that's only 6 years' time. If we use Ross Garnaut's idea of the superpower and say, let's get on to making liquid hydrogen from water, not using coal, can't we make that a really big export industry for Australia?
Well, we can, and virtually every company. I'm a director on Woodside Petroleum. Taken a bit of a pounding on the stock market in the last 3 days.
Hasn't everybody?
I think we were $36 in January, and I think we're just over 22 today. We've got a hydrogen strategy. I mean, we don't see our future just in natural gas. So I think every company's trying to crack the hydrogen code, but as we discussed earlier, it's an issue of cost. It's 15 times the cost of gas. We've got to get that price down.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Those companies are making progress. My understanding is that they currently make the hydrogen from natural gas, And you can go down that route and make hydrogen from natural gas. The problem with that is you're left with the carbon dioxide. So you're still left with carbon capture and storage if you're going to do it that way. But if they get to the point which they're intending to do, produce the hydrogen from renewable energy, then you can get there. But you need to get very low cost renewable energy, very low cost electrolyzers, and a pretty efficient hydrogen production, hydrogen to iron ore process. Now, all of those are potentially feasible, and there are many people who are working on that. And I think, personally, that's one of the areas we are going to be looking at, because it could create the very jobs you're talking about. It's a perfect segue to the next Grattan report, which we may very well have a discussion about in this very room. So thank you for that question. It wasn't a Dorothy Dixer, I can assure you. Look, we're finished. I think there's a lot of stuff we could have gone on for a long time, but we haven't got time. We try and get people out reasonably close to the time we said. Thank you very much for your attendance. Firstly, I need to also thank the State Library, Eloise and Emma, who are here, my colleague Beatrice Ringrose, who's been heavily involved in the organisation, certainly Ian and Peter for their insights. You may notice that we managed not to beat each other up too badly in the process. And thank you for attending, and hopefully you'll be back for future Grattan Queensland State Library events this year. Thank you very much.